So, you're tired of getting hated out of every game of Commander you sit down for. You could either settle for your full flavor Theros Enchantress EDH deck and get smoked by Craterhoof again. You could join a CEDH group and play games that are finished before you can draw your second card, or you can continue to slowly lose your friends over a children's card game and then just lock them out of being able to do anything about it without immediately looking like a coward. If that last option sounds appealing, this, my friend, is the deck for you. Let's get into it.
So Zur is a 1/4 flying human wizard for Esper and 1 with the triggered ability whenever he attacks, you can search your library for an enchantment that costs 3 or less and put it directly into play. So at its core, the deck is a Pillow 40 Esper control list that, while isn't entirely reliant on having Zur in play, it's definitely built to take advantage of his tutor ability in just about every way possible. Cyclonic Resonator is a card that really can help speed things up with Zur, being a 2-mana artifact that lets us copy a triggered ability for 2 generic, and we get to choose new targets. So essentially we get 2 enchantments straight into play every turn once we get cooking with this. Generally, when piloting the deck and tutoring proactively, depending on what the board is like, we typically start out searching for one of 2 things. The first thing being ways to start filling up our hands quickly. Some obvious cards for 3 CMC or less are Necropotence, Rhystic Study, Mystic Remora, and Phyrexian Arena. Necropotence is a 3-mana black enchantment that lets us pay 1 life to essentially draw a card at our end step as many times as we want at the cost of skipping our draw step. Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora draw us a card whenever an opponent plays a spell unless they pay additional mana for it, which they seldom will. And Phyrexian Arena draws us a second card each turn in exchange for 1 life. All 4 of these are great to get out early to start pulling ahead on cards, so we're better able to influence the game as it goes on. The second thing we generally want to dig for with Zur are going to be Pillows for the Fort. While this isn't as scary as a lot of Zur decks, it does typically draw a lot of attention, so as a kind of insurance policy, it usually is best if we just don't allow our opponents to actually attack us. We do this through enchantments like Propaganda and the white propaganda that isn't Fox News, Ghostly Prison. These are both 3 CMC enchantments that make each opponent have to pay 2 mana per creature to attack us. Blind Obedience comes down a turn earlier and makes our opponent's creatures and non-basic lands come into play tapped. We can also extort other spells off of this later to gradually drain our opponents as well. And a few other cards that aren't tutorable with Zur but are still absolutely worth running are going to be Sphere of Safety and No Mercy. Sphere of Safety has a similar effect to Propaganda, only instead of 2, it's X for each creature, where X is equal to the number of enchantments we control. With the ability to copy this enchantment, it's not hard at all to make it to the point where your opponent just cannot pay enough mana to attack you. And No Mercy is a 4-mana enchantment that destroys any creature that does manage to actually damage us. So one of the more frustrating things this deck can easily do is creating a lock that actually all around prevents us from taking any damage. The combo is based around a card called Energy Field, which a lot of people probably don't know exists. It's a 2-mana blue enchantment from Urza Saga that prevents all damage dealt to you, the catch being that you have to sacrifice Energy Field whenever a card is put into your graveyard. So what if we could make sure nothing hits the graveyard at all? Enter cards like Rest in Peace. While acting as a foil to graveyard decks, its primary function in this deck is to keep Energy Field in play. So we can't take any damage and nothing can enter the graveyard, but we're not done yet. The second part of this lock involves making sure our opponents don't just remove 1 or both enchantments. Greater Oromancy is a 2-mana enchantment that gives all other enchantments Shroud, meaning they can't be targeted by spells or abilities. So now we're getting close, but we still have one hole in the plan, and that's that Greater Oromancy itself doesn't have Shroud. Yet. Cards like Copy Enchantment, Mirror Maid, Estrid's Invocation, and Clever Impersonator are all great value cards in a deck like this anyway, but when they copy Greater Oromancy, they give each other Shroud, meaning none of your enchantments are touchable. One hand kind of washes the other. So now the only realistic way for an opponent to actually break this lock would be cards like Merciless Eviction, Cyclonic Rift, or Council's Judgment. If we really want to go all in on protecting this lock, and we do, If you're anticipating a certain card from an opponent, or if you think someone has one of those specific ways to deal with this lock, Nevermore lets us name a card, and that card can't be cast for the rest of the game. We can also make copies of Nevermore if need be, although honestly, just keeping up mana for counter spells should be more than enough to suffice. Depending on your budget and how competitive you want this deck to be, the exact permission spells in the deck aren't super important, but I would run at least a few. My go-tos in EDH are Mana Drain, Counterspell, Dissolve, Mystic Confluence, Archmage's Charm, and Dovin's Veto, although really you can substitute some of the more expensive ones for any number of cheaper counterspells. So now that we're essentially immune to damage, we need a more proactive strategy. We can still lose after all, through Infect, Mill, or even effects that make us lose life directly, because Energy Field doesn't prevent losing life, only damage. Which might seem like semantics, but there is a difference and it does matter. And also, nobody wants to play against a Pillow Fort deck that only plays reactively. People honestly are not going to want to play against decks like this anyway. So my preferred way to close out a game with this deck is with the inclusion of a Voltron package for Zur. Since he is an invasive commander already, that makes commander damage a more compelling strategy. Straightforward enchantments that can be tutored like Empyrial Armor and All That Glitters are perfect and can easily buff up Zur huge early on into a game. Steel of the Godhead gives Zur +2/+2 and unblockable, as well as lifelink since he's both blue and white. And Empyrial Armor gives +1/+1 for each card in our hand, which pairs great with cards like Vincer's Journal and Reliquary Tower, since we are going to be drawing a lot of cards off of our enchantments. Shielded by Faith is an added insurance policy against removal, giving Zur indestructible. Similarly, Diplomatic Immunity gives Shroud and has Shroud itself. And lastly, Vanishing lets us phase Zur out as needed to dodge removal. Sometimes games go long enough and boards get wiped enough times that it's not unheard of to run out of relevant enchantments to tutor for with this deck, which means enchantment recursion in a deck like this isn't always needed, but I do like running at least 2 or 3 ways to recur things in the deck. Replenish is probably the best card for this, but it's also gotten a little pricey over the years, and because it's on the reserve list, that likely won't change anytime soon. Starfield of Nyx does a decent imitation as well that can also double as creating threats out of your enchantments. This does leave them vulnerable to creature removal, but you can just keep recurring them, so it's not really a huge deal. And Hanna Ship's Navigator is another good option in the deck. Just keep in mind that we can't recur spells with Rest in Peace in play, and anything that goes to the graveyard while Rest in Peace is in play are going to be gone forever, so be careful. And as with any deck, we're going to want some removal. In this build, I specifically like to include tutorable options to be able to answer threats with Zur as needed. Oblivion Ring and Banishing Light are both great catch-alls and are probably the most obvious inclusions in this list. Grasp of Fate is similar, except it hits all of our opponents, which is definitely nice. Imprisoned in the Moon is a great way to turn creatures or planeswalkers into lands. And Aura of Silence is a great way to answer any problematic enchantment or artifacts, while also taxing any that they may still have in hand. It also never hurts to just have a few catch-all removal spells like Anguish Unmaking and Vindicate, though feel free to replace these with whatever you see fit. These are just what I like running. As with most decks in EDH, you'll want a few reset buttons in the form of board wipes as well in case things start going south. The numbers here will depend on a lot of things, but I like aiming on the higher side with this deck. Supreme Verdict is an unconditional, uncounterable wipe that I'd say is a must include in the deck. Winds of Wrath is also a cool inclusion for a deck like this, also killing all creatures that aren't enchanted. Toxic Deluge is a 3-mana board wipe that lets you control what creatures die to some degree by paying life. It's not uncommon to have Zur on board and dump like 5 or 6 life into this to kill everything except for Zur. And Damn is a great piece of single target removal for 2, but can also become a Wrath for 4. Merciless Eviction is a great versatile board wipe. You can exile all creatures, artifacts, enchantments, or planeswalkers for 6 mana, which is a little bit higher, but the versatility is honestly worth it. And of course, overloading a Cyclonic Rift is just a great way to make sure nobody wants to play another game with you ever again. So between being able to tutor for Rhystic Study and Necropotence, this deck rarely has a hard time drawing cards, but I still like to include a decent amount of other card draw spells and cantrips, just to kind of speed things along. The list is near endless, but I like to include cards like Dig Through Time, Ancestral Vision, Ponder, Preordain, Thirst for Knowledge, and Sphinx's Revelation. But again, feel free to include whatever you have in your collection, and there are obviously way better options than these. This is just what I'm running currently. I wouldn't hang up too much on card draw for the deck. I would just be sure to include a few. I try to keep this deck on the lower side of the higher power level scale. However, you can absolutely refine the deck further by including more optimal card draw spells or by running none, honestly. Another thing is tutors. You can absolutely run things like Demonic Tutor, Diabolic Tutor, Vampiric, all of those. As with EDH, when you have more tutors like that, I feel like the power level kind of inherently goes up, which I'm not super into because this deck is already really strong, but that is an option. So as with any decent commander build, we do want to find ways to ramp. Unfortunately, since we're not in green, we'll have to rely pretty heavily on artifacts. I didn't include cards like Mana Crypt or Mana Vault, as again, the power level is just a little too high for my liking in my meta, but you can absolutely include them in your build if you'd like, alongside Soul Ring, any of the Signets or Talismans. I like running all three of the Diamonds, Worn Power Stone, Cold Steel Heart, Mind Stone, Chromatic Lantern, and Commander Sphere are all great options. Another great piece of ramp for the deck is Smothering Tithe, and while it barely misses the threshold to be tutored from Zur, it's still amazing to play from hand and quickly makes treasures for us. And arguably the least sexy but most important part of the deck is the mana base. We do have some flexibility here, but it's generally best to try to make sure we can have all three of our colors by turn 3 or 4 at the latest to be able to cast Zur on curve if not a turn early. For this reason, we want to include as many dual lands as we can. Build within your budget, of course, but the better your mana is, the more consistent your deck will play. For this reason, I like to at least include any on-color fetches, shocks, alongside like pain lands, check lands, and filters. Again, whatever you have is probably fine. If you have the original dual lands, those are obviously great, but most people don't. Ideally, we do want our lands coming in untapped, but scry lands and bounce lands work great in a pinch. Command Tower is an auto-include in just about any EDH mana base, and Prismatic Vista and Fabled Passage are also both great fetches in most decks. On top of this, we want to run a decent amount of basics. Your numbers may vary depending on your deck, but with cards like Path to Exile being so common, you definitely want to have something to fetch for. And while we do want to dedicate most of our land to good color fixing, there is some room for utility lands. I personally don't run a ton in this deck, but cards like Riptide Laboratory are incredible with Zur. You can bounce him in emergency, which is just great utility from a land, especially in a deck like this. So that is it for my Zur EDH deck tech. I'm really sorry for the delayed upload this month. I had a lot of out-of-state shows with my band. I was in the process of moving. I had surgery. It has been a super hectic month, so I do apologize. Thanks so much for watching this. Yeah, and let me know if you want to see more EDH content in the future. I would love to do things that aren't strictly cube related. That being said, there are tons of cube things in the works. It just might be a while before they get uploaded, unfortunately. But thank you guys so much for watching.